and welcome to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm Mark Simon. Matt Minatarian is getting married this week, so we found three people to fill in his place. First, we talked to one of our two SIS injury experts, James Rodriguez. We'll touch on Derrick Stingley, Drake London, and a number of the other top picks to gauge their health as we look to 2022. Then we bring in one of the leaders of our draft prospect evaluation team, Nathan Cooper. He'll run down the top draft classes based on our scouting grades. The Eagles were among them, so we bring in Bo Wulf, Eagles beat writer from The Athletic, to zoom in on their draft and their big trade. So let's get started. James Rodriguez is a member of our two-person injury evaluation team, along with John Veros. And just to establish James' credentials, he has a doctor's degree in physical therapy and spent 7 years as a physical therapist. James, what are your credentials for evaluating football and football injuries?
Well, I was here last year with SIS as a football scout, so I was watching countless amount of games and charting them. And then as far as injuries, that was another responsibility for me, was to watch the injuries as they happened and then try to pinpoint what structure was involved. And so what I can do is I can use my knowledge of anatomy, kinesiology, and biomechanics to try to identify the structure that was affected. And I do this by knowing what we call the mechanism of injury, the player's reaction on the field, and then also the athletic trainer's assessment of the player on the field. Basically, a trainer will go out there, they conduct special tests. That just means they're doing a test to kind of look at the integrity of something that they suspect is involved. And I know the test as well. So gauging what the trainer's doing on the field, I can have an idea of the structure, number of structures they're looking at to kind of pinpoint not just the region, but the more specific area involved during the injury.
So it's essentially taking a much more educated guess than someone like myself would.
Sure. Yeah, you could put it that way.
If you go to the SIS NFL Draft website, nfldraft.sportsinfosolutions.com, every player has an injury flag. Those were all assigned by you and John, and I'm curious what the process was for evaluating injuries and giving flags.
Yeah, so, I love doing this. It was basically, we wanted to give each prospect a flag, a designation, whereas in the past, we just kind of highlighted certain athletes that may have had significant injuries. This year, we wanted to cover them all. So what I would describe it as is a three-step process. The first step was to do a literature review, find all the research out there about NFL injuries and ability for the athletes to participate in the NFL. And so with that being said, we care about participation, not production. So we're looking at the number of snaps a player was involved in, amount of games, starts, length of career. And we used all that information to try to come up with a template. And that template is what provided us with these injuries are red, these injuries are yellow, and these are going to be green. And it's not just, I want to say, injury specific, but it's also position specific. So for instance, an ACL is going to be a yellow injury unless there are multiple ACLs to the same knee, or you were an offensive lineman, defensive lineman, or linebacker, because historically those positions have had a harder time getting on the field and staying on the field. So that was the first step. And then the second step was to go through and look at every single athlete's injury history, cross-reference our database against all of the public, doing a research, internet search, basically to try to find every single detail that we can and listing them out for each prospect. We used that template we created with the injuries that we have listed, and we were able to assign grades. And then the last part of the process was to go in there and actually implement the flags for the prospects themselves. And so when we did that, basically each prospect's going to have an overall section, and the scouts were responsible for putting any injuries that may have happened to that athlete during their career. So we read through those injuries, make sure that list matches our list. And so what's great about our draft site is it gives you a value to the injury that you're going to read that player experienced. You can go to any other draft site, which I don't know why you would, but you can go somewhere else and you can basically see the injuries. They make comments on them, but it gives you no value. We give you value to the injury. So we give you something that says it gives you basically what I would call the level of concern. And it's pretty neat because you can use it as another tool for comparing athletes to another and basically injuries to another. So we did all the hard work for you.
Again, NFL Draft, sportsinfosolutions.com. The thing that you said about offensive linemen and torn ACLs, that was particularly interesting. But let's go through some players and put what you did to use. And we'll start not with an offensive lineman, but with Derrick Stingley, who went number 3 overall to the Texans. He played only 3 games this past season. Foot injury, had surgery. Texans feel confident enough to put him all the way at 3. They let a lot of good players go through to do that. What's his prognosis?
Yeah, so Stingley suffered a Lisfranc injury, and I don't want to get too into the weeds of the anatomy of the injury. Basically, it's the midfoot, the middle of the foot. It's a very stable region, at least it should be. When you have that injury, there's varying degrees or grades. If it's a high enough grade, it's going to warrant surgery. So his injury required a surgery to fixate and stabilize it, basically. So with that being said, I mean, I was reading a lot of reports about Stingley, and NFL teams weren't concerned about him. Now they have their own medical evaluators looking at him, testing him, putting him through imaging to see, how much separation is happening in that area when he's putting weight through the foot, all these other tests and measures they can look at. And they felt confident with it. Now, I don't have access to that. All I can go off of is he had a Lisfranc injury. It was severe enough that it required surgery. Based off of those factors, we gave him a red because athletes returning from that injury have a decreased number of games played and a decreased number of starts over the length of their career. So we'll just have to see how it plays out. But obviously, the Texans felt really good about it after they looked, since they took him number 3 overall.
So the Lisfranc makes you nervous on Derrick Stingley. That's an interesting contrast to what wound up happening. This is a receiver-rich draft. The receiving class had some questions within it. There were all these receivers that were taken pretty quickly. There was a big run on them. Let's start with Drake London and his fractured ankle. He also had a hamstring strain that pushed back his pro day, but all that said, he went 8 to the Falcons, and people seem to think that he's the leading candidate to be Offensive Rookie of the Year. You think he's going to be okay?
He was the number 1 receiver taken off the board, and our injury flags have no concerns. We got him as a green. Now, although he had the ankle fracture and surgery, and it may look gruesome when you rewatch the injury, from all the data that we've looked at over the time, it really hasn't played too much of a significance in his ability to play in games just from that injury alone. So he gets the green for us. And then in regards to the hamstring strain, this was a guy that was waiting to actually participate in physical activity. So he tried to ramp up his training load to get ready for his pro day. He may have accelerated it quicker than he should have. And anytime you do that, you're going to predispose a muscle injury to tweaking a little bit. But when he's all set, I don't have any concerns about him.
So maybe a little overeager, but a green light overall on Drake London, a contrast there to Stingley. Jameson Williams to the Lions. He tore his ACL in the national championship game. And then he's like, oh, I'll be healthy by training camp. Really?
Yeah, I don't know about that one. He's probably eager to get on the field.
If they all are.
Yeah, sure. We want to see him. He's a great athlete, great prospect. But I care about the long game, not the short game with him. So if I was a Lions fan and I was hearing that he was going to return by September, October, I'd be super nervous. Some surgeons don't even want their athlete to return to football-related activity until 9 months after surgery. So that's putting them right on the border. And in addition to that, we're not just talking about the physical component of his rehab. There's a psychological component. This athlete needs to trust his leg. He needs to have full confidence that it's going to be able to do everything that he does and withstand the forces as he's making his cuts and jumping and doing everything that he needs to do. Because it's not only that leg that's at risk, but it's also the opposite leg that may be at risk another ACL injury. So for him, just be very careful. I wouldn't expect to see him until November, December, just to get some reps before the next season and just kind of go on from there. Like, don't rush it, please, Williams. Be smart about it.
So it's kind of like a yellow flag with a hint of red?
Yeah, if he's not managed properly, it could be a red, right?
Okay, and that's on the Lions then?
It's on the Lions, yeah.
Yep. All right, with that, I've talked to many college athletes that have torn their ACLs, and I'm curious about, and this certainly will pertain to Odell Beckham Jr. too. Can you talk about the medical advances that have been made with ACL injuries in the last 10, 20 years that would allow Jameson Williams to be like, oh yeah, I'll be back by training camp?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, the greatest advancement in the care for ACL injuries is the individualized approach. that they not only do for the surgery and the decision making of the surgery, but also the rehab process itself. I mean, surgeons are even just the timing of the surgery, they're going to make sure certain parameters are met before they take them under the knife, right? They want to look at the stage of inflammation and the amount of swelling, the amount of range of motion in that knee, what's the state of it before they even go through the operation. And then they have to decide, like, what's the technique we're going to do? They're going to look at the anatomical placement of the graft. They're going to look at the type, the size, the shape of the graft, and all that stuff is going to be geared towards that athlete's profile. What's that athlete's size, their position, their sports specific demands? Like, what do they need to do? And that's going to be intricate into the decision making. That's the same process that goes through their rehab. There's going to be these benchmarks that they need to meet before they go on to the next one. So it's just very individualized. It's very specific. I think it's great. And you're seeing athletes return from the injury and being able to perform, but you need to be mindful of that individual. And I think that's what we're doing a better job doing.
Jameson Williams will be certainly an interesting test case for this season. Speaking of ACL tears, Treylon Burks had one too. He has a collection of injuries: a knee sprain, a foot, an ankle, a shoulder, and a chest injury. And yet, he only missed 2 games. He went 18th to the Titans. Titans traded A.J. Brown. How should they feel about Treylon Burks?
Oh, for all those little bumps and scrapes and things that he got dinged up with, he stayed on the field. So you gotta like that about him.
Yep.
As far as he gets the yellow flag for us specifically because of that ACL injury. I mean, we're talking about the knee, which is the most common region affected during football. And we're talking about a ligament that is a stabilizing force of the knee. So those 2 factors is why an ACL is always going to be a yellow if you have a history of it. Now, the fact is he experienced his in 2018. So he's been on the field producing for quite some time. So that gives you confidence. So if I could give like a shades of yellow, he would get a lighter shade in an essence. You know what I mean?
Fair.
Yeah.
Yep. Fair, exactly. I think that's probably the word. All right, so Treylon Burks, a yellow. Jameson Williams, as we said, yellow with a hint of red. Drake London, green light. You feel pretty good about him. Derrick Stingley, you've got concerns. He's red flagged for you. There was one other thing that you guys wanted to bring up, and it was Justin Ross and Damone Clark, both with neck surgeries. You gave one a yellow, you gave one a red. Explain everything that went into that.
Yeah, so Justin Ross, they both had surgeries that required a fusion basically to their neck. And the difference is that Justin Ross, he got a red flag for us, and that's basically because it was what we call congenital. It was an issue with his neck that he was born with. And that's not the case for Clark. So that's why Clark gets the yellow flag, Ross gets the red flag, because the origin of the injury is different. And the draft actually reflects what we ended up doing, because Clark got drafted and Ross ended up undrafted being picked up. Chiefs ended up signing him.
Just to recap everything that you've said, recap it again. Derrick Stingley Jr., concerns, red flag. Texans took him at 3. They must feel better about him than you do. Drake London, green light. You feel that was good. Falcons at 8. He's going to be fine. Jameson Williams, this will be interesting. A lot of things to think about with him as we go forward. Treylon Burks, similarly, a light shade of yellow on the flag, meaning caution, but not too much caution, because in the end, Treylon Burks stayed on the field, and that's something that I think Titans fans will probably admire about him. And then what you just said about Damone Clark and Justin Ross. Justin Ross, you have more concerns about because it's a congenital injury, as opposed to Damone Clark, who's going to the Cowboys. More of a caution there, despite having had his surgery just in March. Are there any other medical advancements related to football that we should be keeping our eye on as we go through the summer here?
I think the biggest thing is there's a lot of technology that's advancing. So we, general public, right? We wear all our Fitbits and our Garmin watches, and we're tracking our steps and heart rates. But I mean, at the athletes level, at teams levels, they're doing that too. They're just using more complex tracking devices, and that's where it's growing to. So, teams will use these GPS trackers to quantify, the distance an athlete's running, the number of sprints, the intensity of the sprints, how many times they're accelerating and decelerating, and the collisions for a player, what was the impact of a collision. And they're using all this information to kind of optimize their weekly training loads so that you can minimize the injuries and then also maximize their performance. So these training regimens are being designed specific towards that athlete. And you can identify athletes that may be overtraining, which would increase their injury risk, undertraining where they're not optimizing their performance, or training right at that level that they should be. The other facet with all the wearable technology is it helps with the development of equipment, right? So we can try to create helmets and mouth guards that can, protect the athlete and their head and neck, but also give you a real time value for the force of impact that they were received. And it can actually give real time updates to the medical staff on the sidelines to let them know, hey, this guy received the impact of this degree, and they have a color coded system, but it's growing in a really good way, a useful way that can try to keep these athletes safe. And that's what the ultimate goal is, right? To keep these athletes safe and help them stay on the field for a long time. And, hopefully we can make like the LeBron Jameses and the Tom Brady's more of the rule than the exception, right?
Yep. And it's a violent game, as Matt always likes to say. James Rodriguez, I'm sure we'll be talking to you more as the season gets closer. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I'm joined by Nathan Cooper, one of the leaders of our NFL draft scouting team. Coop, John Todd, and our VP, Matt Minicherian, oversaw all our football scouting rankings. You can find everything at nfldraft.sportsinfosolutions.com. Coop and John and a few other members of our ops staff offered a comprehensive draft review on our website, 3,000 words, based on which teams did best in our rankings. I'll read off the top 5. 1, Jets. 2, Eagles. 3, Lions. 4, Ravens. 5, Panthers. That's Jets, Eagles, Lions, Ravens, Panthers. Coop, give us a broad strokes overview as to why the order is what it is.
Yeah. Hey, Mark, thanks for having me. Obviously, anytime you have 3 first-round picks, it's going to be hard to get a low grade. And that's the situation for the Jets. They nailed all 3 of their picks, though. Plus, they got 4 more solid players later in the draft to round out, our top-ranked class. Moving on to number 2, we'll talk more about the Eagles, here coming up soon. But getting Jordan Davis and Nakobe Dean, both with 6.8 grades for us, 2 of their picks there really helped their ranking. Number 3, Lions, our number 1 overall player was Aiden Hutchinson, so that really helped out. And then he was one of only 3 7-0 players for us this year. And then obviously traded up for Jamison Williams, our number 2 receiver. And then at number 4, the Ravens, they just keep doing this year in and year out, taking the best players on the board. Kyle Hamilton falls to them at 14, Tyler Linderbaum late in the first. 9 of their 11 players graded out as a 6.3 or better. So a lot of really good talent headed to Baltimore once again. And then finally at number 5, the Panthers, their first pick, one of our top rated guys. And then they took 3 6.5 graded players in Matt Corral, Amari Barno, and Cade Mays later in the draft as well.
And 6.5s are guys that are pretty capable of being impact fairly quickly.
Yeah, you're looking at low-end starters there. Not a guy who's going to come out, maybe be a solid 3-down player right away. But by year 2, we're seeing those guys as probably sub-package type players.
So again, Jets, Eagles, Lions, Ravens, and Panthers. And with that, we welcome in Bo Wulf from The Athletic. Bo covers the Eagles. We wanted to zoom in on one team in particular this week. We'll probably do another zoom in the next week or 2 as well. The Eagles ranking, it's a little odd given that they didn't have a lot of picks, but they maximized what they got. They got the number 1 nose tackle on our board, Jordan Davis, number 14 prospect overall. They got Cam Jurgens in the second round, modest number 5 ranked center for us. Then they got the number 2 will linebacker, Nakobe Dean. We had him as our number 15 ranked player overall. I know that The Athletic had him maybe 10 back of that. He slides to round 3. I know we also like Grant Calcaterra, who the Eagles got in the 6th round. And free agent signings, they did pretty well there. They signed Carson Strong as a free agent quarterback. We had him in our top 5 quarterbacks. And by the way, bury the lead. Big trade to get A.J. Brown, which we can talk about. But Bo, first, give us an overview of the Eagles draft gets.
First of all, thanks for having me, Mark. And you touched on pretty much most of it since they only had 5 picks. But they make the trade up from 15 to 13 to get Jordan Davis in the first round. Then they make the A.J. Brown trade. Then they draft Cam Jurgens in the second round, as you said, to be sort of the Jason Kelce replacement in waiting. Then they grab the falling Nakobe Dean in the third. And then they only had 2 picks on day 3. They took Kansas sort of Sam linebacker prospect, Kyron Johnson, who can do a little bit of pass rush. He's undersized. And then Grant Calcaterra, as you mentioned. But to me, like if we just sort of set aside the A.J. Brown thing, because that is for the Eagles a home run, given that they didn't have to give up too much in relative to like what Marquise Hollywood Brown fetched in terms of trade compensation, for instance. It's like that's a win for the Eagles, no doubt. The Jordan Davis thing to me is interesting because, in your guys' rankings, for instance, you've got Kyle Hamilton at number 3 overall, and the Eagles take Davis over Kyle Hamilton. And the Eagles, their organizational emphasis is always going to be on the lineup. But like, I do feel like that is the sort of like parallel universe sliding doors for the Eagles here is what if they had gone Kyle Hamilton and then you could probably get a defensive tackle in the second round? Would that have been better for them long term? Obviously, they make the bet on Jordan Davis and his upside. And I think like safety valuation in the draft is an interesting thing across the league. For instance, the Cowboys, Jerry Jones held up his picture of the Cowboys board, and my colleague at The Athletic, John Machota, was able to zoom in and figure out what those rankings were. And they, passed on a safety on their board who had a higher grade in Lewis Seen from Georgia. He was one of their 14 first round graded players. And instead they took an offensive tackle in Tyler Smith, presumably because of the positional importance. So I think how safeties are valued is interesting, but I do view the Jordan Davis over Kyle Hamilton as sort of the decision that the Eagles made that will be followed for a long time.
I like the sliding doors comp. Good movie. Coop, why are you so high on Jordan Davis?
Yeah, I think Bo hit it. There's a ton of upside there. He's just so athletic. We saw it at the combine. Obviously, some questions around the stamina, the motor. I think some of those things will come. The coaching staff can get that out of him. But when he puts it all together, he's dominant. It's really tough to block him. He doesn't want to be, if he doesn't want to be blocked, it's hard to block, and he can get to the ball. We feel like he's a 3-down player, already dominant run defender, needs a little work in the pass game, but has all the traits to be able to get to that 3-down level. And
I know this is a big thing that we talk about as a company. We don't talk much about need-based drafting. We talk about getting the best player available. Coop, were you surprised by the fact that they passed on Hamilton in that spot? Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of people were, and I was surprised. Some other teams passed on him as well. There was a lot of talk leading up. He could go anywhere from 2 to really 15, just depending on how things shook and just how everything did shake out. Him still falling down the board a little bit. There was talk about Philly taking Jordan Davis if he was there. I think if you were going for Jordan Davis, you had to leap Baltimore, which is what they did. But bringing up the good points there, Kyle Hamilton, rated higher, at least on our board. And I think a lot of people considered him the number 1 player in the entire draft. So I think it's a little surprising, especially where the defense is currently. But yeah, Bo hit it. You're looking at the defensive line, and, there's obviously questions about the value of the safety position in the NFL right now. And Nakobe Dean, we had rated pretty high as well, very high, as a matter of fact. He slips to the 3rd round. Bo, we have a question on him in a second, but Coop, why do you like him so much? Yeah, he's got the high motor, the pursuit. He just always seems to be around the ball. Can do a little bit of everything. He can play the run, he can cover, he can blitz. The big thing for me was the size, the lack of length. But for a guy like that, you can't overthink it. Obviously, the injury probably played into it. But I think this guy, assuming he's healthy, this guy's going to be a fun guy to watch in Philly. He's going to fly around. And yeah, Bo, I have a question for you on Dean here. One, what's the latest on the injury, if you have anything? Is that something that's going to affect him starting the season on time? And then where do you see him sort of slotting in the lineup? Yeah, so it was interesting, when Howie Roseman came down for his post-round press conference on Friday night after rounds 2 and 3. He said, Nakobe Dean is going to be on the field this weekend when we have rookie minicamp. He's good to go. Their doctors acknowledge that he has this pec strain, but it's nothing that guys on the roster haven't already had and played through. It's sort of the bumps and bruises of, playing 4 years in the SEC, they say. So from their perspective, it is not something that's going to hamper him at all as a rookie. It might come back to bite him down the line, but to me, the slide was interesting because I think it was probably more about the league valued him as more of a 2nd round talent than a 1st round talent. And so the slide wasn't quite as precipitous as it might have seemed to us from the outside. And I think part of that is because he's undersized, and also because that injury, he also had a sort of a nagging knee injury, meant that he couldn't test in the pre-draft process. So teams didn't have some of those numbers on him that they would have liked to see, because I think there are some questions about his true speed. But, Howie Roseman has said,
and this is like what all GMs say, so we take it with a grain of salt. But that when the Eagles were on the clock in the second round with pick number 51, their decision was between Cam Jurgens and Nakobe Dean. Those were the two guys at the top of their board, and they didn't think there was any way they were going to get him in the third round, and they didn't have any pick ammunition to move up if in case he was falling. So they were just sitting there crossing their fingers and hoping. I think that's like, again, that's what every GM says. Like, we can't believe this guy fell to us, but I sort of believe it from their perspective on Dean. It's also one of those weird things where, like, you imagine that being in the draft room, the longer a guy like that slides, the more you're like, well, what are we missing? Like, why is this guy falling? And you sort of start to second guess yourself. But, Howie Roseman said he talked to like the doctors 4 times as the pick was approaching just to make sure that they were good to go. And Nakobe Dean, from his perspective, when he talked to us after he was drafted, said that he is totally good to go. Like, he has talked to doctors who said, you don't need any time. You did not need surgery. You are ready to go. So we will see how that plays out. The Eagles are betting on their guys, but it's going to be interesting to follow for sure.
Where do you see him sort of slotting in? Do you see him as more of a Mike, a Will type player, or how do you think the Eagles view him?
Yeah, for them, I think if you look at what they have, I think he's probably going to be more of a Mike for them because they signed Kaiser White from the Chargers, who is a little bit more of a Will. And it's also interesting because, like Nakobe Dean, the questions are, is he going to be able to handle like size at the next level, right? Can he hold up? And lucky for him, he has Jordan Davis with him again to keep blockers occupied, just like he did in college. So that seems like a good fit. I think it's going to be interesting. Right now, the Eagles have TJ Edwards penciled in as the Mike linebacker, and he'll pair with Kaiser White. But I feel like if Nakobe Dean is healthy, he's going to be on the field and playing pretty much 3 downs.
Before we get to A.J. Brown, the other picks and also the free agent signings, I know that, and Coop can articulate on this, but first, Bo, what did you make of the late round stuff and the free agent signings that they made, even the Carson Strong?
Yeah, so Carson Strong, I think the knee is what stopped him from getting drafted. I think teams have like a do not draft grade on him because it's like a degenerative knee condition that he has. But I would imagine that he was like close to top 5 non-medically for most teams as you guys have him. And that sort of reflects itself in the guaranteed money that the Eagles gave him. I think it's like over $300,000, which is like at the very top end of the market for guaranteed money for those guys. And he had, I think, a lot of offers, so much so that the Eagles weren't sure they were going to get him, and they ended up agreeing to terms with a different undrafted quarterback. That was E.J. Perry from Brown. And so then once Strong said he was coming to the Eagles, they let Perry go somewhere else because there just aren't enough practice reps for both guys. So I think he'll compete to make this roster. Reed Sinnett is the guy who is their number 3 quarterback right now, and I think I would probably make Strong the favorite as long as he proves to be healthy. And like there's upside for him to grow into the number 2 job. The Eagles have Gardner Minshew, who's on the last year of his rookie contract. So that's a job that could be won. And then the other thing they did is they really overloaded at corner. They signed Mario Goodrich from, I think, I forget his first name, but Blackwell from Duke, and then Josh Jobe from Alabama. And those guys all add to what is a cornerback room that has a lot of young depth, but nobody sort of jumping up at the top to be their number 2 cornerback opposite Darius Slay. Last year's 4th round pick, Zach McPherson, is probably the guy who you would say is the favorite, but they also acquired a bunch of guys during the season last year to sort of add to that depth. And I think that's a fine strategy for them, especially when you consider that last year they signed Steven Nelson in July as a veteran free agent, and he played fine as the starting corner. I think there are veterans on the market who they could sign around training camp if they want to. I think they want to see what these young guys have. And especially in this defense, there's not a lot asked from that position opposite Darius Slay. So I think that's a fine strategy. I'm a little bit more concerned about safety. Right now, it's Anthony Harris and Marcus Epps who are penciled in as the starters, and a couple of guys who as backups who are, unproven to be kind. And I think they would like to add somebody to that mix, but there are not a lot of veterans available. It's different than corner. Really, the last guy who was starting caliber who was on the street was Tyrann Mathieu, who signed with the Saints this week. So I would say if they're going to make a move in terms of like a trade or something, that's a place to look.
I just want to run back to the draft picks just real quick and ask about Cam Jurgens. I know you brought this up just a little bit. Jason Kelce obviously teetering on retirement the last couple of years. They drafted Landon Dickerson last year and then take Juergens this year. We see Juergens as a starter, but more of that center only type of player. Do the Eagles view him as that way as well, or do they feel like maybe he's more of a versatile interior player? And I know you mentioned that he's more center and waiting once Kelce is out of there, but is he a guy that they see coming in and playing center? I think a lot of Eagles fans last year thought that was the case when they drafted Dickerson. So sort of what's the plan with, once Kelce retires with Juergens and Dickerson?
Yeah, so I don't know if you guys saw the video of Jason Kelce talking about this. He was on a Bleacher Report live stream, and he was saying that like he did scouting on all these centers, and he's done it the past couple of years. And Juergens is the guy who was his favorite of all of them. He sees the most of himself in Juergens. Now, I worry a little bit about the Eagles like trying to find the specific Jason Kelce type, because he's so unique that it feels like sort of chasing a ghost to some degree. But we asked about, is Juergens a center only? And the Eagles said they view him as being able to play guard. There's a spot at right guard that could be one. I think Isaac Seumalo is probably going to get that job. And you would imagine that Juergens will cross-train across those three interior line positions. As for Dickerson, I think the Eagles were open to him being that long-term center. But last year, the way things played out, Seumalo gets injured and Dickerson plays left guard next to Jordan Mailata, and the Eagles sort of stumbled upon this like just dynamic tandem between those two guys, these really big guys who work well together and have sort of this budding friendship. And it's like they decided they didn't want to mess with that. It's too good. There's no reason to mess with that. And it's interesting because the Eagles have sort of drafted the Kelce replacement for going on like 5-6 years now. Like Seumalo, who is approaching the end of his extension, was once upon a time supposed to be the Seumalo or the Kelce replacement. So it does feel like this is the last one. This is the final one, and it has Kelce's sign off. But this is sort of the roll of the dice you take when you draft like a backup in the second round. Is like if Jason Kelce plays this year and decides he wants to come back for another year, the Eagles aren't going to say no. Like he'll be back, and they're going to have to find another spot for Cam Juergens. So it's interesting. But it is like this is what the Eagles do. They focus on the line of scrimmage, and they make a habit of drafting guys who may not necessarily start right away. I think of their last 12 first or second round picks, 9 of them have been drafted, to be backups as rookies. So that's sort of what they do.
We kind of have buried the lead a little bit here. We talked for almost 15 minutes, and we got into AJ Brown a little bit at the very start. Why do they like him so much?
Yeah, I'm guilty of this too. It's like we spend more time talking about Kyron Johnson and Grant Calcaterra than we do about the like all-pro level wide receiver. I mean, why do they like him? Because he's awesome. I think first of all, he's young. He only turns 25 in June, so this is different than like a Tyreek Hill or Devontae Adams acquisition. Even this is a guy who they can envision as being a part of this offense for a long time, and certainly he better be, given that they signed him to a 4-year, $100 million deal. But he totally changes the face of the offense, I think. And it's interesting. This is a good case of watch what they do and not listen to what they say, because, the Eagles sort of made a case all offseason publicly that they were fine at the wide receiver room. Like what's really going to improve the passing game is more targets for Devontae Smith and more targets for Dallas Goedert and more targets for Quez Watkins. Meanwhile, they were like potentially trying to trade for Calvin Ridley. They tried to sign Christian Kirk and Allen Robinson. So it was clear that they knew that they needed to upgrade at that wide receiver position. And what this does is it serves sort of two purposes on two separate timelines. It allows them, one, to like best evaluate, is Jalen Hurts the guy? Like, let's give him all the weapons he could possibly need and give him a chance and prove that he can make this leap from year 2 to year 3 and potentially be our quarterback. And we've got him on, a rookie contract. That's great. And if he does it, awesome. And if not, next offseason, when they've got 2 first-round picks and 2 second-round picks, they can look like an attractive team to a veteran quarterback. And, we see these veteran quarterbacks or veterans of all positions sort of being more able to control their destiny and move teams than they have in the past. And if you're, I don't know, let's say Kyler Murray or Lamar Jackson or whoever, and you're looking at like, where can I go and enter like a ready-made offense to compete? you look and see AJ Brown and Devontae Smith, and you think, okay, that's a pretty good spot to be. So I think it has served both purposes for them, and it's going to be interesting to see how things play out.
You basically answered my last question here for you, which is the quarterback situation. You kind of brought it up there for the longer term. In the short term, how do they feel about Jalen?
Yeah, I mean, so again, this is like watch what they do, and watch what they do is, they tried to be involved in acquiring Russell Wilson and Deshaun Watson. So obviously they are not sold on Jalen Hurts as the longtime guy. Their sort of party line answer has been that, like, we don't know exactly what Jalen Hurts' ceiling is, but we feel confident that because of the way that he's wired, he will hit whatever that ceiling is. And that's I think that's sort of fair. It's backed up by like how hard he works and how much his teammates love him and all that kind of stuff. We sort of said on our podcast, Birds with Friends, that like he's good at everything. He has everything you want from a quarterback except for throwing the ball. And it's like Nick Sirianni said this at the combine. He's like, yeah, like the only things we want to see him improve on are accuracy and reading defenses. Like, okay, well, those are like the number two, like the top two jobs of the position. So, I mean, I think there is belief that he can improve on those things, and they have set him up very well this season. I think they should be considered like, co-favorites for the division at this point. But I think there are real questions that he can be the guy, and knowing just like how Howie Roseman views the quarterback position and how Jeffrey Lurie views the quarterback position, my guess is they're going to continue to be sort of quarterback curious and keeping their eyes open for an improvement.
Bo Wulf, you can read him in The Athletic, covers the Philadelphia Eagles. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
This wraps up this week's episode. You can go to nfldraft.sportsinfosolutions.com to read about every team's draft class, 400 players in all, detailed analytics, player evaluations, and much more. And check out our other podcasts, the SIS Baseball Podcast and Playing in Space, our basketball podcast, which digs in deep on the NBA playoffs this week. For James Rodriguez, Nathan Cooper, Bo Wulf, and our producer Justin Stein, I'm Mark Simon. Thank you for listening to Off the Charts.